just how much lithium is available in the Salton Sea for us to mine.
So we estimated that in our first report, and I can give you the numbers. So the in-place lithium is about almost 4 million metric tons, we estimate, at a minimum. And if you consider the entire thermal anomaly that is the geothermal field, it might be as much as 18 million tons. That's lithium carbonate that we calculated as that because that's the most commonly marketed product. So somewhere between 4 and 18 million metric tons of lithium carbonate is in the Salton Sea brines.
These days, lithium powers almost everything, from the phone in your pocket to EVs. But traditional lithium mining needs water, a lot of it. And the way we extract it today has a huge environmental cost. Hello, listeners, and welcome to H2O and Beyond. My name is Alex Hahn, and each week we dive into the science, systems, and stories behind the water we use every day. In today's episode, we'll actually be taking a trip back to the Salton Sea. If you guys listened to last week's episode, we talked about the health effects of the Salton Sea because right now the lake is shrinking and underneath all that water, there's some toxic dust and it's currently being picked up by some winds and it's affecting the surrounding communities. So if you're interested in that, feel free to check it out. Now, today, I'm joined by Dr. Michael McKibben from UC Riverside, and he's actually going to help us explain what lithium is, how it's mined, and actually how the Salton Sea could be a key player in the lithium industry in the upcoming years. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. McKibben. It's great to have you on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Nice to be here.
So something I like to ask my guests before we start is if you can, give us a little introduction of who you are, what you do, and the place you work at.
Okay, so I'm a geochemist and economic geologist. I'm retired from my professor position at UC Riverside. I taught there for almost 40 years. But I was asked to come back on recall to do research on lithium together with my colleagues from Lawrence Berkeley Lab. So that's what I've been working on the last 2 years is lithium at the Salton Sea, geothermal lithium.
Mm-hmm. And I see, so you currently don't teach at UC Riverside anymore, correct?
Not anymore, no. I just do research.
And, I'm interested, how did you get into this field of work?
So I actually visited the Salton Sea geothermal well when I was a freshman in high school.
Wow.
Back in 1967, which was a while back. And our high school had an earth science instructor who was a PhD,
Mm-hmm.
and he took us on all these field trips, including down to the Salton Sea. And so that sort of got me hooked at that point. And then I did my senior thesis and my master's thesis on the Salton Sea. So I've been working on it on and off over the decades. And I worked on it professionally once I became a new faculty member and worked on NSF projects and DOE projects down there over the years. And I've worked with the geothermal companies over the years down there. So it's been a part of my life for a long time.
Yeah, and on this channel, we love to cover the Salton Sea. I find it really fascinating, and I actually never got an eyewitness account of how it was back in the '60s because I know the area back there was like booming. What did you think when you went there as a freshman?
So it was quite a tourist attraction in the 50s and the early 60s. When the water level was high.
Yeah,
people would actually water ski in the sea and fish and eat the fish. And you don't want to do that anymore. And it's not even deep enough to water ski in anymore. So
yeah,
it was quite different back then.
And when did you personally start noticing the decline of the sea?
Well, it's happened over the last 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
The drought that's plagued Southwest California began 10 to 15 years ago. So it's dramatically accelerated, I would say, over the last 8 or 9 years. So places I used to walk down to at the shoreline are now probably a couple of 100 yards away from where the actual shoreline is now. It's retreated that much.
Well, yeah, I didn't realize it was a couple 100 yards. Yeah, that's a pretty big difference.
Yeah, the vertical aspect of the sea is very shallow. It's like a saucer.
Wow. And are you currently calling from the Salton Sea, or where you?
No, I'm at home near Riverside.
I see. Well, so before we dive into the environmental effects of mining lithium and all that, I want to assume our listeners know not like absolutely nothing about the topic. What exactly is lithium, and why are we hearing so much about it on the news lately?
Okay, so lithium is atomic number 3 on the periodic table. It's the lightest of all the metals by weight, and you can store more energy per volume and per weight in lithium than any other metal. So it's very valuable for powering things. And traditionally, lithium was mainly used early on in making greases and ceramics,
Mhm.
but its demand really took off a while ago, a few decades ago, when lithium batteries were developed for mobile devices. So you're probably too young to remember the Sony Walkman, but I still remember it.
No, yeah.
And so that used Sony had to invent batteries to power that thing, and they had to be small and light. And so the lithium batteries was developed initially for that, and then along came cell phones, and now we have laptops and tablets and earbuds and AirPods and all sorts of stuff that requires lithium batteries. And then more recently, electric vehicles, EVs, and especially lately, battery electrical grid storage. So all those have really taken off over the last 10 or 15 years, and that's why the market for lithium is accelerated very rapidly.
Now, like, how exactly do you like store energy inside a metal? How does the chemistry of that work?
So there's like any battery, there's an anode and a cathode, and the electrons move from one end to the other. And so lithium is very effective at storing a lot of electrons and then allowing them to be moved to the other end of the battery. And it's more effective than any other metal in doing that.
And what did we use before lithium was like lithium popularity like really took off?
So we used to use lead acid batteries in your old vehicles. They're still used. We used to use nickel cadmium batteries.
Mhm.
These are all based on various metals, and then nickel metal hydroxide, and then lithium ion batteries were developed, and they're more efficient than any of the old types of batteries.
I see. And are there any alternatives to the lithium batteries right now, or is that like really the main thing the world is focusing on?
That's the main thing right now. There's some other alternatives people are looking at, like zinc batteries and sodium batteries, but lithium's going to be dominant for a long time, I think.
I see.
Nothing else is as light and as
Hmm.
capable of storing energy.
Yeah. And where does the most of the world's lithium currently come from?
So, two places. Most of the world's lithium is mined in Australia from hard rock open pit
Hmm.
operations. And then the second most important place is what's called the Lithium Triangle in South America. That's Chile, Argentina, and probably pretty soon Bolivia from the salar deposits. Those are dry lake bed deposits. So, those two areas of the world, which of course are all in the southern hemisphere, is where we get most of our lithium.
I see. And there's actually a common misconception around the world right now. I think that we're gonna like run out of lithium one day. Is this true?
That's not true at all. There's plenty of lithium in the crust. We just need to find places where it's concentrated and can be mined. The problem nowadays mainly is just where it's produced, which is in the southern hemisphere, and where it's consumed, which is in the northern hemisphere. So it's a supply chain issue. So most lithium comes from the southern hemisphere, and we make most of our batteries and EVs in the northern hemisphere. So we end up shipping it around the world, and it's that supply chain problem that's the thing we're facing.
So is it just like inefficient to ship it like all the way around the world? Does it like jack the price up and stuff like that?
Well, why pay for the shipping and the carbon emissions related to fuel use during shipping if you can produce it locally and not have to move it? So that's the advantage of having a local supply chain, and that's what the U.S. and a lot of other northern hemisphere countries are looking at is ways to develop their own local supply chains.
I see. And is there a reason why most of the world's lithium is in the southern hemisphere? Does it come down to like geography?
It's sort of a combination of where historically lithium deposits were first explored and
Mhm.
mined. So it's really more of a historical accident. But we now know there's equivalent lithium deposits in the northern hemisphere. So, for example, McDermott caldera in Nevada and the Smackover in Arkansas. There's There's oil fields up in Alberta and Canada. And so there's more northern hemisphere deposits that are being discovered all the time. Salton Sea, we would count among those.
Yeah, and is when people talk about like lithium extraction, are we talking about like a solid metal that they like sort of like take out of the ground, or
Well, in terms of the current mining, it's in a hard rock called a type of granite that's called pegmatite. So they have to blast that out of the ground. They have to crush it and grind it up, and then they have to soak it in sulfuric acid to try and roast it at high temperature to try and pull the lithium out of the mineral structure. So that all takes a lot of energy and creates a lot of dust and noise. In terms of the salars in South America, that's brine underground under these dry lakes. And they're pumping that brine out of the ground and dumping it onto evaporation ponds. They're each about the size of a soccer field, and you can see them from space on satellites. And then they let the sun do the work there. They let the sun evaporate the brine and concentrate the lithium. And they end up with a brine that's very rich in lithium chloride, which is what's used to make the battery components.
oh, I see. So lithium can actually be found either in brine in like South America or in rock deposits in Australia, correct?
Exactly.
And I often see images online. I'm sure our viewers do too. Are you talk the lithium mines in the lithium triangle? It's like these giant ponds of like colored water, right? Is that what we're looking at?
Yeah, so the color is due to the different metals in them. And so when the lithium is very concentrated in the brine, it actually changes the color of the brine.
I see. And like so how exactly is like lithium extracted in like South America compared to Australia? Like what are the key differences there?
So they let the sun do the work, and it takes about a year for the sun to evaporate the brine to a level where they can then further concentrate it by precipitating the chlorides out. And they need to try and separate the different chlorides from one another, like magnesium chloride interferes with lithium, so they need to pull the magnesium out. And so the main expense is in separating the lithium chloride out from the other compounds that are in the brine. With the hard rock, it's mainly the energy and the noise and reagent use to crush and dissolve the rock that's the main issue.
Oh, I see. So lithium actually exists inside the brine as like an ion that you need to separate out from all the other ions, correct?
Exactly. So you're trying to produce a concentrated solution that's called lithium chloride,
Hmm.
and that's what they would market.
And they use the heat energy from the sun. It just automatically does all that separating.
It does the evaporation, it removes the water,
Okay.
but the evaporation doesn't separate the ions you don't want from the ions that you do. So you have to do other things like precipitation and other kinds of solvent and other kinds of extraction to actually separate the metals from one another.
And from your expertise, how impactful is this lithium mining for the environment in both Australia and South America?
Well, it's impactful in both ways of doing it. So South in Australia, it's got the problem that all mining has, right? You're opening up huge pits by blasting the ground. You're crushing rock and making dust, and then you're using all these reagents, and you have an acid effluent stream because of the sulfuric acid you're using. So you have to find a way of disposing or neutralizing the acid effluent, and that's common to a lot of mines. In the case of the salars in South America, the main problem is that when you pull the brine out of the subsurface and put it into ponds, that displaces groundwater that's next to the brine underground. And so that tends to move the groundwater around, and that can deplete the lagoons that are nearby of their groundwater source of fresh water. And that then impacts the flamingos, which forage and breed in those lagoons. And the flamingos are a major tourist attraction and a source of tourist revenue. So the upsetting the groundwater balance is not only bad for tourism, but can affect the ability of the local groups, especially indigenous groups, to grow their crops. So it's quite a different set of problems, really, environmental and ecological problems associated with the salars than the hard rock mines.
And you talked about some sort of like, was it an acid effluent inside the hard rock mines?
Mm-hmm.
So how exactly are they getting the rock into contact with this? Are they like putting the rocks in like some sort of big pit, or how does that work?
So they have to grind up the rock and crush it to a fine size so it can interact with the acid. And then they put it in a furnace because they have to heat it up to a very high temperature and basically cook it.
I see.
So it's like a giant oven.
And are people around these communities directly affected?
So they could be affected by the noise and the dust in the case of Australia. And, if the effluent pond where they store the acid leaks, that could leak into the groundwater and or local water, surface water, and create problems. If they're all using fossil fuel energy to drive all this, then they're creating CO2 emissions, which of course are causing climate change. So there's a whole bunch of different issues that have to be thought about
Yeah,
and accommodated.
I see. And yeah, I think it is pretty big news that the inside the lithium triangle, the flamingos and these countries are actually like driving their tourists away because the flamingos don't have like it's like they don't have the water to be able to like drink, or is that it? I forgot how it works.
Yeah, so these lagoons are used for both foraging by
Mhm.
the flamingos and breeding grounds. So sort of hurting them twice. It's hurting their food source and it's hurting their breeding grounds.
I see. Well, yeah. So now onto my probably like my favorite part on like or sorry, my favorite topic on the show to talk about, which is the Salton Sea. And I know there's been some big investments there regarding the lithium industry. Can you walk us through like what exactly is going on over there?
So it's important for people to realize that they're already producing geothermal energy at the Salton Sea. So there's very hot brine about 2 miles beneath the sea. It's not connected with the sea at all, but they drill down up to 2 miles down to tap this hot brine and they bring it to the surface up these wells. And on the way up the surface, the brine boils because it's so hot. And so it comes out of the wellhead at the surface as a mixture of brine and steam. And they send that into what's called a separator, which uses gravity to make the brine sink to the bottom and the steam being lighter floats to the top. And then they can take that steam and turn turbines. And then the turning turbines in turn turn generators and make electricity. So that's how they make geothermal energy or electricity from these brines, is by pulling the steam out of them. And then they have to condense the steam back to liquid water. And then they combine that with the brine that's been boiled or flashed and lost its steam. And they re-inject all that back in the reservoir. And that's how they maintain the reservoir and avoid depleting it. And so that's already going on. And so the lithium is in the brine. And so to get lithium out of the geothermal brines, you just have to add on basically another plumbing circuit where you pass the brine through an absorbent that's usually a clay-like aluminate absorbent that selectively pulls the lithium out. And then you can separate the lithium from the brine and combine it with chloride and make lithium chloride just like they do in South America. So that's the process they're all looking at doing. So they've already got the plumbing paid for and the plants paid for. So the only additional cost is the additional circuit to do what's called DLE, or direct lithium extraction. And the challenge is finding the clay absorbent that will work at the very high temperatures that the brines are at and not break down thermally or chemically. And so that's been the big challenge, is finding an absorbent that can survive the brine at high temperatures.
Yeah, and you mentioned that the brine itself won't run out, correct?
So it runs through the plant and then it
Mhm.
gets, it's cools a little bit as it moves through the plant. And because it's cooled a little bit, it's now very heavy and dense. So you don't have to force it back into the ground. It'll actually flow into the ground on its own because it's heavier than when it came out.
I see. If you're making a bunch of steam with this brine, won't you like eventually like lose some of like the groundwater brine deposits eventually, or
So they've been running the Salton Sea geothermal field for over 40 years and they haven't depleted the reservoir yet. Um, and yeah, you do lose some water to steam, a small fraction, because as I mentioned, they cool the steam after it's gone through the turbine and
so you can reclaim some of that,
condense
right?
it. Yeah, they condense it back
Mhm.
to liquid. But I mean, they might have to run the field for 50 or 100 years to see any depletion. But
I
so
see.
they monitor that very carefully, and so far they haven't seen it. That's different than some other geothermal fields like the geysers up in near Santa Rosa and San Francisco, the Cerro Prieto down in Mexico, where they're not re-injecting the brine and the steam back into the ground. They've seen those reservoirs become depleted, and it's been a problem for them.
I see. And like, are you familiar with like the geothermal plants? I think up in Iceland, do they do the same thing as the ones in like San Francisco?
Yeah, they're somewhat similar to the geysers up north. They're in a
Hmm.
different kind of rocks. The geysers is in hot granitic rock, and the Icelandic geothermal fields are in hot basaltic rock. So the rock type's a little bit different. And there's more of a seawater component in the brine in Iceland because, as you know, it's surrounded by seawater.
Yeah.
There's more of a continental component in the geysers and the other Western U.S. geothermal fields. So the water's a little bit different, but it's all the same principle.
Yeah, I see. And how exactly does this adsorbent like selectively pull lithium out of this brine? How does that work?
So the structure of the aluminate, it's called a dual layer aluminate. The closest mineral to it is gibbsite. The electronic structure around the atoms in that clay structure kind of mimic water. And so when the lithium that's sitting in the brine is exposed to the clay, it's kind of fooled and it thinks, oh, here's some fresh water I can go into that I'd rather be in fresh water than the brine where I have to compete with all the other ions. And so it goes into the clay mineral kind of thinking it's a water structure. So it's a bit of a ruse for the lithium to
Yeah.
get it to absorb onto the clay, but that's why it works.
And why do the other ions in the brine not get attracted to this to the clay?
Because the spaces for the clay to absorb the lithium ion are just the right dimensions to hold lithium and nothing else. And so it tends to exclude other ions that are different sizes in different charges and just preferentially absorb the lithium.
Oh, is this where, like pore size of the clay has to come into play? You have to get like the exact like right pore size to pull the lithium ions in and not like any of the heavier elements. Is that it?
Yeah, that's part of it. And the other part is just the structure of the clay itself, whether the spacing in the clay layers will accommodate just lithium or something else.
I see. And is this something you're currently working on? Like making this like experimenting with these different types of clays to pull lithium out of?
Not really. My focus has been on estimating how much lithium is in the brines and how easy it's going to be to pull it out and how long it might last if we start to do that. So it's been more of a resource assessment. And so the Department of Energy wanted to have the lithium in the Salton Sea brines assessed. So they went to Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory and asked their scientific group to make that assessment. And their scientific group called me in 2021 because they knew I was an expert on the metals in the brines there, and they asked me to join their group to do the research. So we've had Department of Energy support to do this resource assessment for a couple of years now, and we're just finishing up our second report, which we'll publish next month. We've already had one report come out. It's 350 pages long.
Wow.
And then we've got a second report that won't be quite as long, but it'll come out pretty soon, I think. And so I've
And
been in the resource end of things.
Mhm. And are these reports like publicly available? Say like if I
Yeah,
wanted to read them, or our listeners could?
you can download them for free off the internet. If you go to my LinkedIn page under my publications section, I've got a link to that. I've got a link to some of my other papers that you can download.
Mm,
So you can download most of them for free.
nice. Well, I'm gonna shift our focus back. So, why is everyone so focused on the Salton Sea right now? And like, what makes it one of the best places in the world to extract lithium? Like, why are people suddenly switching from the deposits in like Australia and the lithium triangle? Why are they all focusing on the Salton Sea now?
So I mentioned the supply chain issue that,
Mhm.
for example, let me give you an specific example. If China were to invade Taiwan, that would probably cut off a lot of our battery supply because, as you know, China makes a lot of batteries in EVs. And so the US is very concerned about developing its own domestic source of lithium and other battery components and making batteries and EVs here rather than in Asia. And so for that reason, the federal government's been very focused on having geologists identify lithium deposits in the US that might be more amenable to production than overseas. So they've kind of focused on the Salton Sea as one area where there's a lot of lithium. Another is the McDermott caldera in Nevada. And then another one is the Smackover Formation in Arkansas and parts of Texas. And that's an oil field brine that has a lot of lithium in it. So the federal government has been very focused on those areas of the U.S. as potential sources of lithium for the future.
I see. And you mentioned China's invasion of Taiwan. What exact role does Taiwan play in like the lithium? I know because I know they make a lot of semiconductors, but I didn't know they had anything to do with the lithium.
Well, it would be a political issue of China cutting us off during a war, right? That's what it would be. It's not that
Oh,
it's
I
not
see. I see.
that Taiwan is directly impacted in the
Mhm.
lithium market. Is that the political consequences of that kind of war could be pretty severe.
Oh, I see. Because you mentioned that China actually refines a lot of like the lithium. People send their lithium to China, right? Is that
Yeah, most of the Australian lithium goes to China and other countries in Asia, and most of the South American lithium goes to China as well.
I see? So they kind of have like this big impact and like big influence on the lithium market. That's why we're trying to shift our focus towards like mining and refining the lithium locally, right?
Yeah, and the same with things like rare earth elements. China also dominates that market globally, and we need to develop our own resources. So they're very similar problems.
I see. And what are some of the challenges that companies face when trying to put in place these lithium mining like um add-ons to the geothermal plants in the Salton Sea?
So the add-ons to geothermal are not that expensive because a lot of the plumbing's already
Hmm.
installed and paid for. But in areas like the uh, McDermott caldera in Nevada, those are basically hard rock mines. They're in clay stones, which are softer than granite, but they still have to be blasted out of the ground and crushed and soaked in acid to pull out the lithium. So they have all the same problems of development that the hard rock mines have, and the costs of blasting and crushing, and the cost of roasting and leaching the ore. In the case of the Smackover Formation, some of those oil fields are pretty well drilled out, and they've already been extracting bromine out of some of those brines for decades. And so it's kind of like the Salton Sea. The plumbing in many of those places is already there, and they just have to add on a DLE circuit to start that whole process. And so I would say cost wise, the Smackover and Salton Sea areas have less of a startup cost and construction cost than something like the McDermott caldera.
I see. And how's the public reacting? Like the public in, I think it's Imperial County. How's the public in Imperial County reacting to this new like wave of interest in the Salton Sea?
So Imperial County is the poorest county in California. It's the second poorest county in the United States. There's a county in Texas or Appalachia that's poorer than them. So a lot of people in that county would like to have jobs, especially for their children, because the main employers in the Imperial County right now are the prison and agriculture. And a lot of young people your age don't necessarily want to work in a prison or go pick
Yeah.
crops in the field, right?
Hmm.
They want high tech jobs, they want STEM jobs. And so if the geothermal companies could develop DLE circuits down there and jobs related to extracting lithium, those would be STEM jobs, better paying than any other kinds of jobs. And so a lot of parents I talk to down there hope that the lithium industry takes off down there uh, because it might keep their kids around instead they
Yeah.
leave after they graduate high school. But there's also groups down there that feel like they've been punished and oppressed for years and exploited for the agricultural work in the fields. So a lot of Hispanic groups and a lot of Native American groups feel that they've been taken advantage of over the decades, and they certainly have in some cases. And so they're not as in favor necessarily of the lithium mining, particularly if their uh, groups don't benefit from the jobs and the revenue. So California set up a lithium tax that brings 80% of the tax back to that county, and the other 20% goes to restoration of the Salton Sea. And I know you've had podcasts on the drying Salton Sea and the health issues.
Yeah.
So the lithium economy is one way of funding some of the restoration and projects that need to be done to try and preserve the sea and reduce the dust emission and asthma caused by that. So
Yeah.
I would say people have mixed feelings depending on which group you talk about down there. If you talk to people in Arkansas, they're all in favor of lithium development there because they've had an oil industry for years. It's kind of declined recently, and they're used to those kinds of jobs, and they'd love to bring them back with GLE and lithium mining from the oil field brines. Nevada's uh, Caldera, McDermott Caldera, people have, again, I think, kind of mixed feelings. People would like jobs. They're used to mining in Nevada. Nevada is one of the biggest mining states in the U.S. Most of our gold comes
Mhm.
out of Nevada. And so people are used to earning a living in the mining industry down there. But at the same time, groups like farming groups and environmental groups are worried about the water depletion that might occur as a result of hard rock lithium mining in the McDermott caldera. So, again, it depends on who you talk to, whether they're wholly in favor of it or somewhat concerned.
And you mentioned like people are really hoping this will take off. How far away in the timeline do you think we're how like how far away from the lithium industry actually taking off do you think we are?
At the Salton Sea,
Yeah, at the Salton Sea.
yeah, at least a year. The companies are still doing a lot of testing work on the lithium extraction, and they're going to do that testing work ongoing over the next year. And then they'll make a decision at the end of that testing as to whether they think they can move forward. It's going to depend a lot on the lithium price and what the overseas competition is for lithium, because you're not going to do it if you're not going to make money off of it. And so the cost of the lithium and the reagents you use to make the lithium products is very important. So they have to convert the lithium chloride into things like lithium carbonate and lithium hydroxide. And those are solid materials, and it takes money and energy to do that. So they have to evaluate a lot of different things before they make a decision where to move forward. But they're all very enthusiastic about it. They want more revenues than just the revenues for making electricity. As a company, if you can earn a revenue source from multiple resources, so geothermal
Yeah.
electricity and lithium and maybe even other things in the brine like manganese and zinc, that's very attractive to you because something's always going to make you money, even if one particular market is down. If the lithium market is down, you might make money off of zinc and manganese, and if the electrical market is up, you'll make money off the electricity. So having multiple resources coming out of your resources is very attractive to you as a company.
Yeah, and I don't believe we talked about this, but just how much lithium is available in the Salton Sea for us to mine.
So we estimated that in our first report, and I can give
Mhm.
you the numbers. So the in place uh, lithium is about almost 4 million metric tons, we estimate at a minimum. And if you consider the entire thermal anomaly that is the geothermal field, that might be as much as 18 million tons. That's lithium carbonate that we calculated as that because that's the most commonly marketed product. So
Okay.
somewhere between 4 and 18 million metric tons of lithium carbonate is in the Salton Sea brines.
And could you put that into perspective, like versus the like sort of like the lithium triangle and Australia? How much is that in context?
I can do it better with the US ones because I know those numbers better. So
Mhm.
that's probably about half of the lithium that's in the McDermott caldera and maybe 1/6 the lithium that might be in the Smackover Formation. So Salton Sea isn't the largest, but it's certainly among the top 10.
And I watched your interview with like California Insider like a couple days ago, and you
Mhm,
mentioned that the U.S. could be
mhm,
completely like
mhm.
self-sufficient on lithium if we manage to fully develop these industries, right?
Yes, exactly. That's the attraction.
Are there like any environmental concerns about lithium mining at the Salton Sea or
Well, they're the normal concerns of the geothermal development because you're using the same processes. So it's, how much water are you using? How much of a waste stream you're generating? Right now, they do have a small waste stream in the form of what's called filter cake or precipitate from the brine. You have to cart that off to a landfill and dispose of it. So doing lithium extraction would add some burden to that waste stream. And then a lot of people are worried about, well, how much water is DLE going to use if you add that on to the geothermal process. And what a lot of people don't realize is geothermal actually makes its own fresh water. So you remember I mentioned that they recondense the steam back to liquid water
Yeah.
before they re-inject it back in the reservoir. They could tap off some of that steam condensate, as they call it, and use that as process water or makeup water for the lithium process. So there's some potential there, and they're looking at that.
And yeah, from your interview I listened to, you mentioned that some people are concerned about the water usage, but you mentioned that the farmers actually use way more water than these geothermal plants and lithium like add-ons, right?
Yeah, so 98% of the current water use down in the Imperial Valley is for agriculture, and a lot of that is used to grow alfalfa, and most of that alfalfa is exported to Asia and India.
Mhm.
And so, geothermal uses a little bit of water, but not nearly as much as agriculture. And if they're really worried about water usage, they should ask themselves, why are we exporting all this water product in the form of alfalfa
Yeah.
overseas? So to me, it's a little bit hypocritical to criticize the water use of geothermal and DLE when it pales in comparison to what they use for agriculture.
Mhm. And do you think there's like any better way to approach lithium extraction that are more like environmentally friendly than the methods we currently have? Even though I know DLE is already, as you mentioned, like it's pretty attractive right now, but are there any alternatives?
No, DLE is probably the most attractive.
Mhm.
And in fact, the South American companies that mine the salars now are thinking of switching over to DLE. So instead of dumping the brine onto the surface as evaporation ponds, they're now looking at doing DLE and re-injecting the brine. And that would solve a lot of their environmental problems down there. So they're
Yeah,
actually looking very seriously at switching over to DLE.
but you mentioned one of the problems of switching over to DLE is that if you don't already have that geothermal plant built there, then it requires like
Right.
a huge investment, right?
It does. And so the capital costs associated with that are the main issue.
Yeah, and these countries aren't the richest either, right? So it'd be pretty hard to get the money.
They aren't, but they have a huge revenue stream from lithium, so why not redirect some of that towards solving that problem?
I see. Yeah, and I'm interested in you. Like, what's some of the work you're doing currently? I know you
Right.
mentioned that you're currently writing up your second report on, estimating how much lithium's down there, but what else have you been doing?
So I've been working mainly on the lithium isotope composition of the brines, and the reason I do that is lithium isotopes can tell us something about how the deposit formed. We can also use lithium isotopes as a fingerprint for the lithium to prove it was produced at the Salton Sea and not somewhere else. And you may remember that the tax credit for electric vehicles was given as long as your electric vehicle battery was produced out of domestic components.
Hmm.
And so, how are you going to prove that? Well, lithium isotopes in the composition of the batteries produced from that lithium is one way of doing that. So, I've been focusing on that too. And I'm not trying to work full time on this. I am retired. I do have time to do things that I'd rather do. So, but that's what I've been working on lately is the lithium isotopes. And I just finished a chapter on the lithium isotopes that will be part of our second report.
Yeah, that's great. And so, these lithium isotopes, they're like little fingerprints. They're unique to every location that lithium's mined in, right?
Yeah, exactly. So we can distinguish lithium from Salton Sea, from lithium from Arkansas, and probably lithium from Alberta. So all the brine deposits, maybe from McDermott Caldera, although I think the jury's still out on that. But we can distinguish Salton Sea lithium isotopically from a lot of other sources.
Wow, that's really interesting. Like they can like now tech has evolved so far, you can actually tell where your battery comes from.
Exactly.
Well, Dr. McKibben, as we sort of wrap this episode up, are there any last words you'd like to say to our listeners?
I think people have to be patient over lithium. There's going to be time that these companies have to do testing both in Arkansas and in California and maybe the Great Salt Lake and some other places. It'll take time to iron out the complications and nuances and details of DLE from these brines. And people shouldn't expect instant revenue and an instant gold rush. Some people call it a white gold rush. It's going to be more likely to be a slow grind than the rush. So I would just caution people to expect that. And one of the nice things about using geothermal energy to extract lithium from brines is you lower the carbon footprint and potentially reduce water consumption compared to the other techniques. And I think people should be attracted by that.
See. Well, Dr. McKibben, thank you so much for joining me today on H2O and Beyond. It was a pleasure having you on the show.
You're welcome. It was nice talking to you.
Well, listeners, hopefully you enjoyed that episode. So, if you found this episode helpful, please share it with your coworkers and friends. And if you want to be a guest on the podcast or have any sort of feedback to give, there's a Google form linked in the description of the episode as well for you to fill out. I'll also link Dr. McKibben's LinkedIn and some other resources to learn about this, the Salton Sea and his work that he's doing right now if you're interested in that. And you guys should also check out his interview with California Insider as well. I personally found that really interesting to listen to. Make sure to check out the H2O and Beyond link tree to follow all of our socials and stay connected with what we're up to. And I actually have something pretty interesting planned out where I'm actually being interviewed by Baxter Woodman, a civil and environmental engineering firm. So be on the lookout for that. I'll post some more updates on the socials there. I'm Alex. Thank you for listening to H2O and Beyond. Stay curious and stay hydrated.